Ma'am, if your child can't behave in first class, maybe you should have booked another seat. The words sliced through the cabin sharp enough to silence every nearby conversation at once. Naomi Brooks froze halfway through fastening her son's seatbelt, her fingers still trembling from rushing across Terminal C with 2 bags hanging from her shoulders and a 6-year-old clinging to her arm. Around her, the warm golden lighting of the first-class cabin suddenly felt colder, heavier, every polished surface reflecting eyes that were no longer pretending not to stare. Jayden sat rigid in the oversized leather seat beside her, his small chest rising too fast beneath the gray hoodie zipped all the way to his chin. Outside the oval window, rain streaked across the runway lights in long trembling lines, turning the airport into a blur of silver and red. The little boy pressed both palms over his ears as another engine roared somewhere outside. Naomi leaned closer immediately, lowering her voice into the soft calm tone only mothers learn after too many hard nights. Baby, look at mommy. Breathe slow for me, okay? But before Jayden could answer, the flight attendant stepped closer again. Claire Whitmore. Perfect blonde bun. Navy uniform pressed so sharply it looked untouched by human hands. Her smile had disappeared completely now, replaced by the thin controlled expression of someone trying not to lose patience in public. You're holding up boarding, she said, louder this time. Loud enough for the businessman across the aisle to glance up from his tablet with visible irritation. Loud enough for the older couple near the champagne cart to stop whispering and watch openly now. Naomi swallowed the heat rising into her throat. She had worked 3 overnight shifts back-to-back at Grady Memorial Hospital just to make this flight. Her sneakers were damp from the storm outside. There was still a faint stain near the cuff of her sleeve from apple juice Jayden spilled during the layover in Charlotte. Exhaustion sat behind her eyes like weights dragging her down inch by inch, but she kept her posture steady anyway. I'm sorry, she said quietly. He just needs a minute. Claire crossed her arms. Ma'am, other passengers paid for comfort. The sentence landed harder than the first one. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the way several people nearby immediately looked away afterward, pretending they hadn't agreed with her. Jayden suddenly curled tighter into himself as another announcement crackled overhead. The intercom distortion made him flinch violently. His breathing shortened. Quick shallow pulls of air. Naomi recognized the signs instantly. Her heartbeat stumbled. Jayden, she whispered, kneeling beside him despite the narrow aisle pressing against her shoulder. Look at mommy, sweetheart. Count with me. 1, 2, but the little boy's hands shook harder now. Claire exhaled sharply through her nose. Does he always do this? Naomi looked up slowly. For one long second the entire cabin seemed suspended in silence except for the rain tapping softly against the aircraft windows and the distant whine of engines outside. Then Naomi answered with quiet dignity that somehow made the words hurt even more. He's autistic. A faint shift passed through the passengers nearby. Someone lowered their eyes. Another passenger stopped typing entirely. But Claire's expression barely changed. If anything, her posture stiffened further, like empathy itself had become inconvenient. She glanced down at Naomi's worn carry-on bag resting near the seat and then back at the boarding pass still visible in her hand. Can I see your ticket again? She asked. Naomi blinked once. I already showed you. I need to verify it. The businessman across the aisle sighed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Jesus Christ, he muttered under his breath. Naomi felt every stare in the cabin settle onto her skin at once. She could feel Jayden trembling against her arm. Could feel humiliation crawling slowly up her neck like heat beneath her collar. But she didn't raise her voice. Didn't argue. She only reached carefully into her purse with tired shaking fingers while outside the storm rolled across the runway and somewhere beyond the cockpit door. Unseen by everyone in the cabin, a pilot in a Navy captain's uniform had just heard the commotion over the interphone and turned his head toward first class. Claire held the boarding pass between two fingers like she expected it to reveal something suspicious if she stared long enough. The soft cabin lights reflected against the laminated card while passengers nearby pretended not to watch. Naomi remained kneeling beside Jaden, one hand gently rubbing slow circles across her son's back while the other rested against the armrest to steady herself. She could feel the pressure building behind her eyes now, not tears, exhaustion. The kind that settles deep into the bones after too many night shifts under fluorescent hospital lights and too many mornings surviving on vending machine coffee. Jaden's breathing still came unevenly, but he had stopped shaking quite as hard. Seat 2A and 2B, Claire finally read aloud, her tone clipped and almost disappointed. She checked the digital manifest on her tablet anyway. Who purchased these tickets? Naomi looked up slowly. My husband. Claire's eyes flicked over Naomi's faded sweatshirt, the scuffed carry-on at her feet, the child curled tightly against her side. The disbelief on her face lasted only a second, but it was enough. Naomi had seen that look before. Grocery stores. Parent-teacher meetings. Apartment leasing offices. The silent calculation people made before deciding whether someone belonged in the room. Across the aisle, the businessman closed his tablet with an irritated snap. Can we move this along? He muttered. Some of us have connections to catch. Claire gave him an apologetic smile before returning her attention to Naomi. Ma'am, I still need you to settle your child before departure. Naomi inhaled carefully through her nose, forcing calm into her voice because Jaden always mirrored her emotions. If she cracked, he would too. He is trying, she said softly. The loud sounds are difficult for him. Another announcement echoed through the cabin overhead, distorted by static. Jaden immediately squeezed his eyes shut again. His small fingers twisted tightly into Naomi's sleeve. Too loud, he whispered hoarsely. I know, baby. I know. Naomi leaned closer until her forehead nearly touched his. Remember what Daddy taught you? 5 slow breaths. The little boy tried. Naomi counted quietly with him under the low hum of the aircraft ventilation system. 1, 2, 3. Around them, first class smelled faintly of leather seats, expensive cologne, and fresh coffee from the galley. Somewhere farther back in the plane, a baby cried briefly before being soothed. Rain continued streaking sideways across the windows while baggage loaders moved below the wing in flashing orange vests. Claire shifted impatiently beside the aisle. If he is medically distressed, we may need to delay takeoff procedures. Naomi looked up immediately. No, please do not do that. Several nearby passengers exchanged annoyed looks at the word delay. Naomi noticed every single one of them. Her stomach tightened. She hated this feeling. The invisible courtroom. The assumption that her child was a disruption instead of a little boy struggling through fear. Jaden suddenly tugged weakly at her sleeve. Mommy. I am here. I cannot find my inhaler. The words drained the color from Naomi's face instantly. She reached into the side pocket of her purse, then the front compartment, then the carry-on beneath the seat. Nothing. Her heartbeat stumbled harder with every empty pocket. Claire noticed the panic immediately. What is wrong now? Naomi swallowed hard. His inhaler should be in my bag. Should be? Claire repeated. Naomi searched faster now, hands trembling as zipper after zipper opened beneath the narrow first-class seat. Receipts. Juice box straws. Crayons. Hospital ID badge. But no inhaler. Jaden's breathing grew shallower again. Not dramatic. Just enough to terrify a mother who knew exactly what those small changes could become. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second, forcing herself not to spiral. Okay, she whispered to her son, brushing curls gently from his forehead. Look at Mommy. We are going to figure this out. But even as she said it, the cabin lights dimmed for departure preparation, and somewhere beyond the reinforced cockpit door, Captain Daniel Brooks was already unbuckling his harness after hearing the flight attendant request medical assistance over the interphone. The shift in the cabin happened slowly at first, almost invisibly, like pressure building before a storm finally breaks. Naomi could feel it in the silence around her. The businessmen across the aisle stopped pretending not to listen. The older woman near the window lowered the magazine resting in her lap. Even the flight attendants working farther down the cabin had begun glancing toward row 2 with cautious curiosity. Jaden sat curled tightly against his mother now, one hand gripping the sleeve of her sweatshirt while the other pressed against his chest. His breathing was still uneven. Not severe yet, but enough to tighten Naomi's stomach into knots. She checked every compartment of the carry-on one more time anyway, her fingers moving faster with every passing second. Nothing. The inhaler was gone. Claire tapped her tablet against her palm, clearly struggling between procedure and irritation. "Ma'am, if your son is having a respiratory issue, we may need to remove you from the flight until medical personnel can evaluate him." Naomi looked up sharply. "Please," she said quietly. "He just needs the inhaler. That is all." Claire's expression hardened in the polished glow of the overhead cabin lights. "And where exactly is it?" The question sounded less like concern and more like accusation. Naomi swallowed hard. She replayed the airport in her mind. The security line. The crowded terminal. The coffee stand in Charlotte. Then realization hit her like cold water. Her shoulders dropped slightly. "I think it fell out at the gate." Claire exhaled slowly through her nose, and that tiny sound carried enough judgment to make Naomi's chest ache. "Wonderful," she muttered under her breath. The businessman leaned back in his seat with visible frustration. "So we are delaying departure because somebody forgot medication?" Naomi heard every word. So did Jaden. The little boy lowered his head immediately, shame flooding across his small face in a way no child should ever understand. Naomi touched his cheek gently. "Look at Mommy." His eyes lifted slowly. "None of this is your fault." But her own voice sounded thinner now, strained beneath the pressure building all around her. Outside the aircraft windows, lightning flickered somewhere far across the runway clouds, illuminating the wet tarmac in brief silver flashes. The captain's announcement chimed softly overhead, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are expecting departure clearance shortly. Thank you for your patience this evening." Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second at the sound of the voice. Familiar. Steady. The kind of voice that always made crowded places feel safer somehow. But before the recognition could fully settle in, Claire crouched beside the aisle seat again. "If he cannot regulate his breathing before taxi clearance, I will have to contact ground support." Naomi looked at her in disbelief. "You want to remove a 6-year-old from the plane because he is scared?" Claire straightened immediately. "I am trying to maintain safety and comfort for everyone on board." "Comfort," Naomi repeated softly. "Not angry. Just tired." The words seemed to linger awkwardly between them. A young flight attendant farther back near the galley hesitated before stepping forward quietly. Her name tag read Melissa. She held something small in her hand. "Excuse me," she said carefully. "I found this near the boarding counter when I came on board." Naomi's eyes widened instantly. The blue inhaler rested in Melissa's palm beneath the warm cabin lighting like something fragile and priceless. Relief hit so hard Naomi almost lost her balance kneeling there. "Oh my God," she whispered. Jaden looked up immediately as Naomi took the inhaler with shaking fingers. 2 quick measured puffs. Then another slow breath. And another. The tension in his tiny shoulders gradually eased inch by inch. The cabin remained completely silent watching it happen. Naomi brushed her fingers gently across Jaden's curls while his breathing steadied against her chest. Then, From somewhere near the front of the aircraft, the cockpit door suddenly unlocked with a sharp mechanical click. Heavy footsteps crossed the galley floor. Calm. Fast. Purposeful. And before anyone in first class could fully turn toward the sound, a deep voice cut cleanly through the cabin. Naomi? The moment the voice reached the cabin, everything changed. Naomi looked up so fast her breath caught halfway in her chest. Standing near the front galley beneath the soft amber cabin lights was Captain Daniel Brooks, tall and composed in his Navy pilot uniform with 4 silver stripes lining each sleeve. Rainwater shimmered faintly against the cockpit windows behind him, and for one suspended second the entire first-class cabin fell completely silent. Daniel's eyes moved instantly past everyone else and locked onto his wife and son. Concern replaced the calm professional expression pilots wear for passengers. Jaden, he said again, already moving toward them. The businessman across the aisle straightened abruptly in his seat. Claire's posture stiffened so suddenly it looked painful. Naomi slowly rose from her kneeling position while Jaden looked up with exhausted relief written all over his small face. Daddy. Daniel crouched beside the seat immediately, one hand gently resting against Jaden's shoulder while the other brushed lightly across Naomi's arm. Hey, buddy. Easy breaths for me. Jaden nodded weakly, clutching the inhaler tighter in his small hand. Daniel looked at Naomi carefully now, reading the exhaustion in her eyes the same way he always did after her hospital shifts. What happened? Before Naomi could answer, Claire stepped forward quickly, her professional smile returning too fast to look natural. Captain Brooks, there was a minor disruption during boarding, but everything is under control now. Daniel lifted his eyes toward her slowly. Calmly. But something in his face changed the temperature of the entire cabin. A disruption? Claire hesitated. Just enough. Naomi noticed it immediately. So did everyone else watching. Daniel stood fully now, tall enough that the overhead lighting caught sharp lines across the shoulders of his uniform. My wife and son were the disruption? The businessman suddenly became very interested in his phone screen. Claire adjusted the tablet against her chest. The child appeared distressed before departure, and I was following safety procedure. Daniel looked down briefly at Jaden still curled against Naomi's side. Then back at Claire. My son has autism, he said evenly. And my wife has probably spent more hours helping frightened people than anyone else on this aircraft tonight. Naomi lowered her eyes slightly at that. Not embarrassed. Just overwhelmed by hearing someone defend her after spending the last 20 minutes swallowing humiliation in silence. Claire's face flushed beneath the warm cabin lights. Captain, I was only trying to maintain order in first class. Daniel glanced slowly across the cabin. The untouched champagne glasses. The polished shoes. The carefully avoided eye contact from passengers who had watched everything unfold without saying a word. Order, he repeated quietly. Then his gaze returned to Claire again. Did you ask if my son was okay before questioning whether my family belonged here? The silence afterward stretched painfully long. Even the soft hum of the aircraft ventilation seemed louder now. Claire opened her mouth slightly, then stopped. Melissa stood frozen near the galley still holding the empty inhaler wrapper in one hand. Naomi touched Daniel's wrist gently before the moment could harden further. Jaden is breathing better now, she said softly. Daniel looked at her immediately, the tension in his jaw easing just slightly. Outside the aircraft, lightning flickered again beyond the rain-covered windows, casting pale silver light briefly across the cabin ceiling. Then suddenly the plane jolted hard enough for several passengers to gasp. A sharp warning chime sounded overhead. The seatbelt signs flashed instantly. Daniel's expression changed in a heartbeat from husband to captain. Focus sharpened across his face like a switch flipping behind his eyes. Another turbulence warning crackled through the interphone clipped near the galley wall. Daniel turned immediately toward the cockpit, But before stepping away he crouched one last time beside Jaden and squeezed his son's shoulder gently. "Daddy has to fly the plane now, okay?" Jaden nodded slowly. Daniel stood and looked once more at Naomi. No words this time. Just a look filled with quiet understanding before he turned sharply and disappeared back toward the cockpit while thunder rolled somewhere deep. Beyond the runway clouds and the aircraft lights flickered once overhead. The aircraft pushed back from the gate beneath sheets of cold rain, engines rumbling low and heavy beneath the cabin floor like distant thunder trapped inside metal walls. Naomi tightened Jaden's blanket around his shoulders while the seatbelt sign glowed overhead in steady amber light. Around them, first class had gone unusually quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Uncomfortable quiet. The kind that settles after people realize they witnessed something they should have stopped. Claire moved through the aisle checking seatbelts with rigid professionalism, but the confidence she wore earlier had cracked around the edges. She no longer looked at Naomi directly. Jaden leaned against his mother's side, exhausted from the sensory overload, his small breathing finally steadier now with the inhaler resting safely beside him. Naomi brushed her fingers gently through his curls while staring out the rain-covered window. Beyond the wing, runway lights stretched across the darkness in long glowing lines blurred by water. Her chest still felt tight. Not from anger. From the weight of being watched, measured, judged, then suddenly respected the moment people realized who her husband was. That part hurt more than she wanted to admit. The engines surged louder. The plane began turning slowly toward the runway. Then suddenly the cabin lights flickered once. A quick sharp blink. Several passengers looked up immediately. Another flicker followed seconds later. This time longer. The businessman across the aisle frowned toward the ceiling panels. Somewhere behind first class, a nervous laugh escaped from another passenger before quickly dying out. The plane paused briefly on the taxiway. Naomi noticed it instantly because Daniel had once explained every normal movement during flights to help calm Jaden's anxiety. This pause did not feel normal. A soft chime sounded overhead. Then Daniel's voice filled the cabin once more, calm and measured despite the tension hidden carefully beneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor systems issue related to the weather radar display. Nothing dangerous, but we will remain on the ground for a few additional minutes while we run diagnostics. Thank you for your patience." The cabin murmured immediately. Phones appeared. Seatbelts shifted. The businessman exhaled loudly again. "Perfect," he muttered. "First the kid, now this." Naomi heard him this time without lowering her eyes. She was too tired to pretend anymore. Before she could respond though, Jaden suddenly tugged lightly at her sleeve. "Mommy. What is it, baby?" He pointed weakly toward the window. "The lights." Naomi looked outside carefully. The rain had intensified, slamming sideways across the aircraft windows now. But through the water she noticed something strange near the left wing. A service vehicle was still positioned unusually close beneath the storm lighting. Then she remembered something Daniel once told her over dinner after another late-night flight. Weather radar problems during heavy storms could delay takeoff for good reason. Pilots depended on those systems to navigate dangerous cloud formations safely. The cabin lights dimmed again briefly. This time several passengers gasped softly. Claire immediately moved through the aisle trying to maintain calm. "Everything is fine, ladies and gentlemen." But her voice lacked the certainty it had before. Melissa appeared beside her near row 2, whispering something urgently while glancing toward the galley interphone. Claire's face lost color almost instantly. Naomi caught only fragments. "Display failure, maintenance still checking, lightning strike possibility." Jaden looked up at his mother nervously. Naomi forced a soft reassuring smile even while her own pulse quickened. "Daddy knows what he is doing," she whispered. And she meant it. More than anyone on board, she trusted the man behind that cockpit door. Minutes passed slowly. Rain hammered the fuselage harder now. The aircraft remained completely still on the taxiway beneath the flashing blue runway lights. Then suddenly the cockpit door opened again. Daniel stepped out briefly, speaking low and urgently with the flight crew near the galley. His face remained controlled, but Naomi knew him too well not to notice the tension in his shoulders. Claire listened silently this time. No arrogance left. No impatience. Only nervous attention. Daniel handed her something from a clipboard, then his eyes shifted toward Naomi for one brief second across the cabin. The look was small. Almost invisible. But Naomi understood immediately. Something was wrong. The rain outside thickened until the runway lights looked drowned beneath water and fog, soft glowing circles swallowed by darkness beyond the aircraft windows. Inside the cabin, the air felt different now. Heavier. Even the passengers who had spent the last hour complaining had fallen quiet beneath the tension settling across the plane. Naomi watched Daniel through the narrow opening near the galley as he spoke with ground maintenance over the interphone, one hand braced against the wall beside him while lightning flickered silver across the cockpit windows behind his shoulders. His voice remained calm. Controlled. But she knew him too well not to hear the strain hidden underneath it. Jaden rested against her side, clutching the small blanket Melissa had quietly brought him earlier. His breathing was finally steady now, soft and rhythmic against Naomi's arm. Exhaustion had drained most of the fear from his face, leaving only the fragile tiredness children were after crying too long. Naomi kissed the top of his curls gently and looked back toward the front of the aircraft. Claire stood near the galley now, listening silently while another crew member spoke in hurried whispers. Gone was the sharp impatience from earlier. The cold, polished confidence. She looked pale beneath the cabin lights, fingers gripping the edge of her tablet tightly enough for her knuckles to lose color. A sudden crack of thunder rolled across the runway so deeply the cabin floor vibrated faintly beneath everyone's feet. Several passengers shifted nervously. Someone farther back asked if the flight was being cancelled. No one answered immediately. Then the intercom chimed softly again. Daniel's voice returned over the speakers, calm and steady like warm light cutting through darkness. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience tonight. Due to severe weather conditions and a malfunction affecting part of our radar display system, we will remain grounded until maintenance confirms full operational safety. I know delays are frustrating, but your safety will always come first. The cabin stayed unusually still after that announcement. No angry sighs this time. No complaints. Just the soft hum of overhead ventilation and rain striking the aircraft body in restless waves. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, hearing his voice. She remembered nights years ago when Daniel studied for his flight certifications at the tiny kitchen table in their first apartment, textbooks spread beside unpaid bills and half-finished cups of coffee. She remembered him working double shifts as a regional co-pilot while she finished nursing school. The sacrifices. The exhaustion. The constant pressure of proving themselves twice over in rooms where people never expected much from either of them. Her chest tightened quietly at the memory. Claire approached row 2 slowly after several minutes, stopping beside Naomi's seat with visible hesitation. For a second she seemed unsure how to begin. The polished corporate smile was completely gone now. "Mrs. Brooks," she said softly. Naomi looked up. Claire glanced toward Jaden sleeping lightly against his mother's shoulder before lowering her voice further. "I did not realize," she stopped herself halfway through the sentence. Naomi studied her calmly. "Realize what?" Claire swallowed once. The rain continued sliding down the windows behind them in long silver streaks. "That he was scared," she admitted quietly. "I thought," again her words failed her. Naomi looked down at her son's small hand resting against the blanket. "People usually think something first," she said softly. "Before they ask." Claire lowered her eyes immediately. The silence between them stretched long enough for the meaning to settle fully. Not cruel silence. Honest silence. The kind that forces people to hear themselves clearly for the first time. Then suddenly the cabin lights dimmed again, sharper this time. A low warning tone sounded briefly overhead before cutting out. Crew members looked toward the cockpit instantly. Claire's head snapped toward the galley. Naomi felt her heartbeat stumble. Seconds later the cockpit door opened hard enough to startle several passengers. Daniel stepped out fast, no hesitation now, storm light flashing across his uniform as he moved through the cabin with focused urgency. And for the first time that night, Naomi saw real fear hidden deep behind her husband's calm eyes. Daniel moved quickly through the first-class cabin, one hand gripping the overhead seats for balance as another burst of thunder rattled the aircraft windows. The calm confidence he carried earlier had narrowed into pure concentration now, every movement precise beneath the flickering amber lights overhead. Naomi straightened immediately in her seat. Her pulse climbed the moment she saw the expression in his eyes. Not panic. Worse. Controlled urgency. The kind pilots trained their voices to hide from passengers. Claire stepped toward him first. Captain, maintenance says the radar display reset failed again. Daniel nodded once without slowing. I know. His voice remained low and even, but Naomi caught the tension beneath it instantly. Melissa stood frozen beside the galley, clutching the service phone against her chest. Rain hammered the fuselage harder now, sharp enough to sound like gravel against metal. Daniel crouched briefly beside Naomi and Jaden. Hey, he said softly to his son. How is my co-pilot doing? Jaden managed a tired little nod beneath the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Daniel smiled gently for him, but Naomi saw how quickly the smile disappeared the second his eyes met hers. What is happening? She asked quietly. Daniel glanced toward the cockpit before answering. The storm shifted faster than predicted. We lost part of the weather imaging system after a lightning surge. Naomi's stomach tightened immediately. Is the plane safe? Daniel reached for her hand briefly, warm steady fingers wrapping around hers for only a second before duty pulled him away again. Yes, he said carefully. But I am not taking off blind into this weather. The sentence settled heavily in the cabin around them because nearby passengers were listening now whether they meant to or not. The businessman across the aisle slowly lowered his phone. Even Claire stood completely still beside the galley, watching Daniel with growing realization. Not just because he was the captain. Because every person on board suddenly understood that while they had spent the evening judging a tired black mother and her frightened child, the man protecting all their lives tonight was her husband. Daniel stood again just as the interphone crackled sharply from the cockpit. His first officer's voice came through strained beneath static. Captain, ground control needs confirmation immediately. Storm cell is moving east faster than expected. Daniel grabbed the receiver instantly. Understood. Hold position. Another hard flash of lightning illuminated the cabin through the rain-covered windows, bright enough for several passengers to flinch. Jaden buried his face against Naomi's shoulder again. She held him closer while watching Daniel think. Really think. Not rushed. Not emotional. Focused. Every eye in first class stayed locked on him now. Claire finally spoke quietly beside Naomi. He could probably still depart if he wanted to, right? Naomi looked up slowly. Maybe. Claire swallowed. But he will not risk people. Naomi's expression softened just slightly, hearing someone else recognize the man she knew. Daniel turned back toward the cabin one final time before heading for the cockpit again. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced firmly enough for the entire cabin to hear without the intercom, we are returning to the gate until the system is fully restored. Some flights push schedules. Some pilots push weather. I do not. Silence followed him immediately. Real silence this time. Not awkwardness. Respect. Even the businessman lowered his eyes. Claire stood frozen near the galley, the weight of the night finally visible all across her face. The aircraft began turning slowly on the wet taxiway, blue runway lights sliding across the windows like reflections on dark water. Naomi looked down at Jaden sleeping lightly against her chest now, finally calm beneath the sound of his father's voice and the steady motion of the plane returning safely toward the terminal. Then Claire crouched carefully beside Naomi's seat for the second time that night. But now her eyes looked different. No irritation. No suspicion. Only shame. "Mrs. Brooks," she whispered quietly enough that only Naomi could hear. "I judged you before I ever saw you." Naomi looked at her for a long moment while rain continued racing down the windows beside them. Then softly, almost sadly, she answered, "That is what tired people like me survive every day." Claire lowered her head immediately as the aircraft rolled slowly through the storm toward the gate under the guidance of the very family she had once treated like they did not belong there. The aircraft finally settled back against the gate with a soft mechanical jolt that rippled through the cabin floor beneath everyone's feet. Outside, rain still poured across the runway in silver waves beneath the airport floodlights, but inside first class something quieter had taken hold. The tension that filled the cabin earlier had burned itself out, leaving behind only exhaustion and reflection. Passengers sat unusually still while the seatbelt sign remained glowing overhead. No one seemed impatient anymore. Phones rested forgotten in laps. The businessman across the aisle stared silently out the rain-covered window, his tablet untouched beside him. Near the galley, Melissa handed out cups of water in careful silence while ground crews moved beneath the aircraft wing outside like blurred shadows in neon raincoats. Naomi adjusted the blanket around Jaden gently as he slept fully now, his small body finally relaxed against her shoulder for the first time all night. His breathing came soft and even beneath the low hum of the cabin ventilation. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, pressing her cheek against the top of his curls. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind only deep tiredness. Her back ached. Her legs felt heavy. But beneath all of it was relief. Claire approached slowly from the front galley carrying a fresh cup of warm tea in both hands. No performance remained in her movements now. No polished customer service smile. She looked like someone carrying the full weight of her own thoughts. She stopped beside Naomi's seat. Quietly. "Chamomile," she said softly. "I thought you might need something warm." Naomi looked at the cup for a moment before accepting it carefully. Heat spread into her cold hands almost instantly. "Thank you," she whispered. Claire nodded once but did not walk away this time. Her eyes drifted toward Jaden sleeping peacefully against his mother's chest. "He looks safe with you," she said quietly. Naomi glanced down at her son. "He is." Claire swallowed hard. The rain continued tapping softly against the aircraft windows beside them like distant fingers against glass. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. Naomi remained silent, letting her continue. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. "Tonight I saw your clothes before I saw your exhaustion. I saw your son making noise before I saw he was frightened. And I saw your skin before I saw your humanity." The words hung quietly between them. Honest. Heavy. Nearby passengers pretended not to listen, but Naomi could feel the entire row hearing every word anyway. Claire looked up again, eyes glassy beneath the cabin lights. "I am ashamed of how I treated you." Naomi studied her carefully for a long moment. She could have humiliated her then. Could have used Daniel's position. Could have let the shame deepen until everyone around them looked away in discomfort. But exhaustion had stripped away any desire for revenge hours ago. Naomi simply took a slow sip of tea before answering softly. "People who spend their lives proving they belong get tired too." Claire blinked hard at that. Naomi continued gently. "Not every mother travels looking polished. Not every child processes fear the same way. And not every family that belongs in first class looks the way people expect. Claire nodded slowly, tears gathering but never falling. You are right. Before Naomi could answer, footsteps approached from the cockpit once more. Daniel emerged into the cabin with his jacket draped over one arm, fatigue visible now beneath the calm professionalism he had carried all night. The second he saw Jayden asleep against Naomi's shoulder, his entire expression softened. He crossed the cabin quietly and crouched beside them. How is my crew? He asked softly. Naomi smiled for the first time that night. Small. Tired. Real. Your co-pilot is finally asleep. Daniel brushed his fingers gently across Jayden's forehead before looking up at Naomi. Then his eyes shifted briefly toward Claire standing nearby. Claire straightened immediately. Captain Brooks, she said quietly. Daniel held her gaze calmly. Not angry anymore. Just aware. Claire lowered her head slightly. I am sorry. Daniel looked toward Naomi first before answering. Then, after a long quiet second, he simply nodded once. Outside the storm still raged across the runway beneath flashing blue airport lights, but inside the cabin the anger had finally given way to something much quieter. Understanding. Nearly 2 hours later, the storm finally began to loosen its grip over the airport. The rain softened from violent sheets to a steady silver drizzle sliding across the terminal windows outside. Ground crews moved slower now beneath the glowing runway lights, their reflective jackets catching pale blue flashes from service vehicles crossing the wet tarmac. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere had changed completely. The sharp tension from earlier felt distant now, washed away somewhere between the storm warnings, the long delay, and the quiet truths nobody on board could ignore anymore. Most passengers sat silently waiting for updated departure information. Some stared out windows. Others rested with eyes closed beneath dimmed cabin lights. Even the businessman across the aisle had softened, his earlier impatience replaced by quiet embarrassment that seemed to age him slightly where he sat. Naomi remained curled carefully around Jayden while he slept against her chest beneath the blanket. His tiny hand still clutched the edge of her sweatshirt loosely, even in sleep, as if making sure she was still there. Daniel stood near the cockpit doorway speaking with maintenance through the interphone one final time before finally exhaling the first deep breath Naomi had seen him take all night. When he looked toward his family again, the exhaustion in his face was unmistakable now. Not weakness. Just the kind of weariness carried by people responsible for everyone else before themselves. He crossed the cabin quietly and sat beside Naomi for the first time since boarding began. The leather seat creaked softly beneath his weight. Neither of them spoke immediately. They did not need to. Outside the window, rainwater slid slowly down the glass beneath rows of shimmering runway lights stretching into darkness. Daniel reached over carefully and adjusted the blanket higher around Jayden's shoulders. He stayed brave tonight, he whispered. Naomi smiled faintly. He learned from his father. Daniel shook his head softly at that, but the corner of his mouth lifted anyway. Across the aisle, Claire stood near the galley finishing paperwork beneath the low amber cabin lights. Every so often her eyes drifted quietly toward Naomi and Jayden before falling away again. Not out of judgment now. Reflection. Melissa approached with fresh coffee for Daniel and set it down gently before returning toward the back of the cabin. Thank you, Daniel said quietly. Melissa smiled faintly. You kept everyone safe tonight, Captain. Daniel glanced toward Naomi after she walked away. We both know who really kept this cabin calm. Naomi lowered her eyes slightly, tired warmth touching her face for the first time all evening. A soft boarding chime echoed through the aircraft moments later. Then Daniel's voice came over the intercom once more, calm and familiar beneath the steady hum of the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, maintenance has completed repairs, and weather conditions are now clear for departure. We appreciate your patience tonight more than you know. The cabin remained quiet after the announcement, but this time the silence felt different. Softer. Human. Passengers slowly returned to their seats while the aircraft pushed back from the gate once again beneath clearing skies. Outside, the clouds had begun to break apart, revealing small openings of dark midnight blue above the runway lights. Naomi rested her head gently against Daniel's shoulder while Jaden continued sleeping peacefully between them. For the first time all night, nobody stared at them anymore. Nobody questioned whether they belonged there. Nobody looked uncomfortable. At the sound of a tired child breathing softly in first class, Claire walked slowly down the aisle one final time before takeoff. When she reached row 2, she paused briefly beside Naomi. No speeches this time. No explanations. She simply placed an extra pillow gently beside Jaden's seat and whispered softly, "I hope the rest of your flight is peaceful." Naomi looked up at her for one long quiet second before answering with simple grace. "Thank you." Claire nodded once and continued down the aisle beneath the warm cabin lights. Outside the window, the aircraft began moving steadily toward the runway while the storm faded behind them across the sleeping airport. And as the plane finally lifted into the dark American sky above the rain-washed city below, the cabin settled into silence broken only by the low steady sound of engines carrying strangers forward together through the night.